Mr. President, thank you. First, I indeed do appreciate the words of my colleague from Colorado, and I thank him for them. And that's a topic that I think deserves more discussion on the floor of the Senate. One of the things that always gives me extraordinary pride to be an American and to be a member of the Senate is the realization, as I sat here today and listened to my colleague from South Carolina, Senator Scott, that neither my ancestors nor his were participants in terms of structuring this republic, and yet today this republic is so grand that it has plenty of room for people like me and him and so many others to participate, including here as one of only 100 Americans who are entrusted with the responsibility of representing our state and also upholding our Constitution in this body. And the senator from Colorado is also right in talking about the role of the Senate, not just in terms of passing laws, but in conducting oversight, irrespective of who occupies the White House. And it's a difficult thing to do these days because everything in American politics is covered through the lens of politics and of elections. Almost immediately, whatever I say here on the floor today will be analyzed through the lens and the construct of elections past and elections future, and what is he trying to achieve, or what are any of us trying to achieve politically, and there's a place for that. We're not, I think, foolish enough to believe that there's no politics in politics. But there's also something that's incredibly important, and that is the Constitution that every single one of us is sworn to uphold. A pledge I again took recently on these very steps, just a few feet away from where I stand here now, just a few weeks ago. And part of that is, in fact, to oversee the foreign policy conduct of the United States. And as many of us are aware, there has been recent discussion in some circles, including in my party, about a desire to achieve a better relationship with Vladimir Putin and with Russia. And I, by the way, share that goal. I think it would be good for the world if the United States and Russia had a better relationship, and in particular with the Russian people, with whom we have no quarrel. But I also think we have a responsibility to understand what the obstacles are to better relations. And it is in that context that I come to the floor of the Senate today, because I've had a lot of people ask me over the last week, in fact, over the last few months, why is it that you have such views about our relationships with Russia and the way forward? And so I wanted to take a moment to discuss that in the broader context of everything else that's happening here now, even as we work through these nominations. The world continues to turn, and events around the world continue to have an impact on us here. Let me begin by saying this, and I don't think this is a fact that can be disputed. Vladimir Putin today has amassed more power in Moscow, in Russia, than any leader in Russia in about 60 years, if not longer. Now, he used to maintain that power through a pretty straightforward deal that he had with both elites and the broader society. And here's the deal he used to have with them. The deal was, I will help you, especially the elites, make a lot of money and become very wealthy. And I will help society at large by helping to grow our economy. In return, however, I need complete power and complete control of the government. And that was basically the arrangement he had up until just a few years ago, when a combination of falling oil prices and economic decline forced them into a different direction. The new model that Vladimir Putin is now pursuing in Russia is one in which he is basically trying to gin up and rally public support. And he's largely doing it through a foreign policy which is aggressive and which is designed to create an impression among the Russian people that Russia has now been restored to great power status, a status equal or on par with that of the United States. And so the first thing we have to understand is much of what Vladimir Putin does is not in pursuit of an ideology like the Soviet Union did. It is, in fact, about domestic politics in Russia and about needing the Russian people to believe that he and his strength is essential to what Russia has. So much of it is about that. What are the prongs of the strategy? The first is he has sought to make their military modern and strong. And you see evidence of that in the fact that while Russia is going through crippling budget cuts as a result of a downturn in the global economy, oil prices falling, and sanctions against the Putin government, they're increasing defense spending. They're modernizing. They're adding capabilities. They are, for the first time, although in a limited way, beginning to conduct naval exercises and projection of power in places they hadn't been in 25 years or longer. The second is a crackdown on internal dissent. And for that, I think the evidence is overwhelming. I know we have all heard recently about the case of Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is a Russian political opposition leader. He's a vocal critic of Vladimir Putin. He works at something called the Open Russia Foundation, an organization of activists who call for open elections, a free press, and civil rights reforms in Russia. This is an interesting thing to talk about because there's been a lot of discussion on this floor a moment ago about the press. There's been a lot of discussion about elections, of course, over the last year and longer, and there's been a lot of discussion about civil rights. Well, just think about this. This is what the Open Russia Foundation works for on behalf of in Russia. Now, in America, when you believe that civil rights are being violated at this moment in our history, or you think the election system isn't working the way it should, or you're defending the press, as my colleagues have done here today, and the right of a free press, you have a bad blog post written about you, someone may run against you for office, cable commentators will say nasty things about you from the other side, maybe somebody will stand up on the floor and criticize you for this or that. Let me tell you what happens when you do that in Russia. They poison you. He's believed to have been poisoned back in February of 2017 after he experienced organ failure, and he's currently in the hospital. So just this month. This comes just 2 years after another suspected poisoning nearly killed him in May of 2015. And I want to take a moment to urge the administration to do everything in their power to ensure that he's receiving the medical care he needs and to help determine who was behind the latest apparent attempt to harm him. If this was an isolated case, you would say, well, maybe something else happened. There is an incredible number of critics of Vladimir Putin that wind up poisoned, dead, shot in the head in their hotel room, found in the street, and other things. In other instances, just today, we have this article from the Wall Street Journal that someone was thinking about running against Vladimir Putin. Alexei Navalny was thinking about running for president. So what happens in America when you think somebody thinks you're going to run for president? They do an opposition research file, they plant negative stories about you, they start bad-mouthing you on cable news. Unpleasant, no doubt. He was found guilty by a kangaroo court of corruption, which of course, according to Russian law, blocks him from running in next year's presidential election. So again, if this was an isolated case, you would say, well, maybe this guy did something wrong. The problem is just about anyone who's either thinking about running for office or challenging Putin winds up poisoned, dead, in jail, or charged and convicted of a crime. So the second thing he's done is he's just completely cracked down on all internal dissent. There is no free press in Russia. And I would venture to guess that if I controlled 80 to 90% of the press reported about me, I'd probably have approval ratings in the 80s and 90s as well. It's a pretty good deal for the leader, but not for the people. The third thing that is part of this effort is they're just basically doing everything they can, Vladimir Putin, to undermine the international order if it's built on democracy and respect for human rights. And I think the example of that is in various places. Look at what's happened in Syria. Vladimir Putin gets involved in Syria, not because he cares about humanitarian crisis, because in fact Russian forces have conducted airstrikes in civilian areas. We've seen the images. It's undeniable that it happened. It is, by every definition of the word, a war crime to target civilians with military weaponry. That's what's happened in Syria. But for Vladimir Putin, it's been successful because his engagement basically changed the dynamic of the entire conflict. He now has positioned himself in the eyes of the Russian people and many people around the world as a power broker in the Middle East, in fact, as an alternative to the United States in that region. This is part of his strategy. It wasn't about Syria as much as it was about his goal of being able to go to the Russian people and say, we matter again on the global stage. Ukraine. In Ukraine, there was talk about moving towards the European Union in terms of economic relations. There was talk about joining NATO. And then he invaded Crimea, and he kept it. And he's funded separatist forces in East Ukraine. And now there's no more talk of NATO, and there's no more talk of unifying the economy with Europe, and they kept Crimea. And just the last few days, we're starting to read open press reports of mobilization and unusual activity among Eastern Ukrainian separatist-backed, supported, trained, equipped by the Russians. And we fear that new fighting could be imminent at any moment once again. And then we've all heard the discussions about the elections in the United States and the efforts of other governments to not just hack computers. It's not about hacking alone. It's about the strategic placing of information gathered through cyber intrusion for the purposes of undermining political candidates and therefore influencing the election. There was something deeper here. It was part of a broader effort to discredit our republic and our democracy. to be able to go back to the Russian people and to the broader world and say the American political system is corrupt, the American political system is not a true democracy, the American political system is as bad as all these other systems in the world that they criticize. They do not come to this with clean hands. And I often wonder sometimes if we contribute to that argument in the way we behave towards one another in our political discourse in this country. And that's something to think about in the long term, because I hope people understand that as we engage in these political debates in this country, these things are being viewed around the world. And for people who may not have a clear perspective, or if this information is being used negatively, and by no means am I saying that we should not have vibrant debate in this country, we should. But I also want people to understand that that oftentimes gives off the perception that, in fact, our republic is on the verge of collapse. We are at challenging times, and we have some strong disagreements, and oftentimes they become heated. I know for a fact that there isn't a single member of this body prepared to walk away from the Constitution or the liberties that it protects and enshrined therein. By the way, I don't believe Vladimir Putin is done in this effort. I think you're now going to see him continue to interfere in Yemen. He can use that as leverage against the Gulf kingdoms, against the Saudis. I think you're going to see him continue to engage in Egypt. He'll go to the Egyptians and say, the Americans are always hassling you about human rights. Why don't you just buy your weapons from us? Why don't you give us a military base? We're never going to give you grief about human rights. We're a much easier, low-maintenance partner. And I wouldn't even be surprised to see him start dabbling in Afghanistan with the Taliban, in some capacity anyway, and couch it in terms of fighting ISIS. We'll see. My point is, it's not done. So I bring all that up in the context of this suggestion among some. And I think it's important to talk about it, because I don't think we should dismiss viewpoints. There are some, including in the administration, who believe that maybe we can do a deal with Vladimir Putin where he helps us fight against ISIS, and in return we lift sanctions. And the argument that I have people ask me, why wouldn't we want better relations with Vladimir Putin and enlist them in the fight against ISIS? And so I come here today in the context of everything I've laid out to tell you why I think that is unrealistic and deeply problematic. Here's number one. Number one is, why do we have to do a deal with Vladimir Putin to fight ISIS? He already claims that he is. In fact, that's the way he describes their operations in Syria, as an anti-terror operation. There is no more dangerous terrorist group in the world today than ISIS. There's certainly no more dangerous and capable terrorist group in Syria today than ISIS. Isn't that what he's already doing? Why would we then have to cut a deal to encourage him to do what he claims to already be doing? There's only two reasons. Either number one, we think he should do more, which in and of itself tells you that he's not doing it, or number two, because he's not doing it now. Here's the second problem. This argument that as part of this whole effort with Russia, one of the things we would be able to achieve is to break them from the Iranians, to create some sort of split between the Russians and the Iranians. I saw an article the other day talking about that as part of this endeavor. My argument to you is we don't really need to do that. That's going to happen on its own. Because say what you want, but as soon as these conflicts, as soon as ISIS is destroyed in Syria and Iraq or in both, the Iranians are going to immediately not just push to drive the Americans out of the region, but drive the Russians as well. The Iranians are not interested in replacing American influence in the region with Russian influence. They want to be the hegemonic power in the region. And so this argument that we somehow could peel them apart, my friends, that's going to happen all on its own. If we abandon there tomorrow, the Iranians would immediately turn to driving the Russians out as well, because they want to be the hegemonic power. They have long desired to be the hegemonic power in the region. And that is going to put them in conflict with the Russians sooner rather than later, at some point here, at least to some level. The third thing I think we have to understand is there is absolutely no pressure, no political rationale why Vladimir Putin needs a better relation with the United States at this time, at least not politically. He's not going to lose an election, because if you run against him, you go to jail. He controls the press. He controls the political discourse in the country. So when you are not one of the reasons why we should always be advocates for democracy, because democratic leaders act much more responsibly because they have to answer to their people. But in essence, that's not what you have in Russia. There is really no reason or rationale why he would be pressured to have a better relationship with us. Do the Russian people want a better relationship with America? I have no doubt about that. I have no doubt about that. But I want you to understand that everything they learn about our relationship with them is largely derived through the Russian press. And if you have never had the pleasure of watching, for example, the RT network on television, and you are interested in comedy and satire, I encourage you to tune into that station from time to time so you can see an alternative representation of events which would startle you and perhaps make you laugh. Well, this is, unfortunately, the sort of media information that filters to the Russian people, that Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin completely control. But here's the fourth and perhaps the most important reason why I think that this endeavor is unrealistic and perhaps even counterproductive. The price we would have to pay is simply too high in return for the alleged benefit that would come about. Number one, the Russian Federation under Vladimir Putin has basically violated every agreement that they have made now and in the past. They're violating the ceasefire. They violated all sorts of arrangements with regard to arms reductions. And they'll continue to do that in any deal that anyone cuts with him. The second is, one of the first things he's going to ask for is the lifting of all sanctions for both Ukraine and for interference in our elections, in return for no changes to the status in Ukraine and no promise of not undertaking efforts like what happened here in the future. The third thing they're going to demand is recognition of a Russian sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, especially in places that are now countries but were once part of the Soviet Union. In essence, a United States acceptance, officially or otherwise, that there are countries in the world who are not allowed to enter into economic or military engagements with the United States unless Russia allows it. You think about that. They are basically going to ask us to play some sort of game of geopolitical chess where we basically turn over the sovereignty and the future of other nations and basically say to them, look, there are these countries in the world and we're not going to try to do anything with them, economic, political, cultural, socially, or militarily, unless you give us permission to do so. This would be a requirement. It is one of the things he insists upon. And he would also, by the way, require, I think, the United States to support pulling back NATO troops and equipment and personnel and operations from nations in Europe, which would be devastating to the NATO alliance, which is one of his other goals, is to render NATO feckless and irrelevant. I just don't think that that is a price worth paying in exchange for alleged cooperation against ISIS that he claims to already be conducting, and in exchange for basically sending a message to the world that America is your ally unless there's a better deal in it with us, with someone else. That would be devastating. So what do I think we should do? And what I hope the Senate will do, if in fact there is an effort now or at any time in the future by anyone to change or conduct a deal of this magnitude. I think the first thing we need to do is be committed to the principle that these sanctions that are in place should remain in place until the conditions in those sanctions are met, until the sovereignty of Ukraine is respected, until these efforts to undermine democracy and spread misinformation are fully accounted for. The second is, I think it's important for us to reaffirm our commitment to NATO, and that includes in the building up of defenses and exercises, that we continue to do that firmly, not just with our NATO allies, but with any nation who seeks cooperation with us. The third is the careful but strategic engagement in the Middle East. To the Iraqis, make very clear that the United States will continue to be their partner after ISIS falls, that we want Iraq to be prosperous and free, and that we believe it's better for the world, and that we're prepared to help them achieve that. To the Egyptians, we will continue to press them on human rights, and we should. But we should also be willing at the same time, and by the way, with the argument that respecting human rights is actually good for Egypt, that in the long term, these conditions that exist will lead to constant threats to their government. But we can do that while at the same time continuing to partner with them on military sales. I think they would welcome a conversation about trade and potentially a bilateral trade agreement with them, about opening up avenues for business investment and so forth. The fourth is to point out that if they're not going after ISIS, then what exactly are they doing now? It's important for us to point that to the world. That, again, I've made this point numerous times, and I want to make it once again. This idea that we're going to get them to cooperate much more against ISIS basically implies they're not doing it now. But they claim that that's why they're in Syria to begin with. And finally, I think it's important for us to try to communicate directly with the Russian people to the extent possible. Now, it's hard to do, because the Russian government under Putin also controls the internet with all sorts of filters and the like. But I think it's important for us to say that our quarrel is not with the Russian people. That for many years, up until this unfortunate turn of events over the last decade, the links between the United States and the Russian people grew strong, and those links remain. I know in my home state of Florida, there are a significant number of Russians who live in Florida part-time and so forth. I hope that will continue. Our quarrel is not with the Russian people, and that we desire for Russia to be powerful and influential in the world, that we want Russia to be prosperous, that there is no benefit to us, that this country does not view this as a zero-sum game, that we do not believe that in order for America to be influential, Russia must be less influential. Our quarrel is not with Russia. Our quarrel is unfortunately with a leader who does view it as a zero-sum game, as a leader who has come to believe in Vladimir Putin that the only way Russia can be more important is for America to be less important. A leader who has chosen to try to undermine an international order based on democracy and free enterprise and human rights that has kept the world out of a third world war. And I think it's important for us to do that. And I think that's important, why we need to at least be prepared in this body, if necessary, to move forward with legislation that doesn't just codify existing sanctions, but that, quite frankly, prevents the lifting of those sanctions unless the conditions in those sanctions are met. This is our job. It is true that presidents and administrations have an obligation, a duty, and a right to set the foreign policy of the United States. There is no doubt about it. And I think that is true no matter who the president. But it would be a mistake, and in my opinion, a dereliction of duty for the Senate and the Congress to not recognize that we too have a duty to shape the foreign policy of the United States, and the power to declare war, in the budgets that we pass, in the laws and conditions that we put in place, in our ability to override vetoes when necessary, even in the process of nominating individuals to serve in the United States government and the executive branch. We not only have the power, we have the obligation to shape and mold and direct the foreign policy of this nation. And if we don't, then we are not living up to the oath that we took when we entered this body. And that it's not a political thing. This is not about embarrassing anyone. This is not about a partisan issue. It should never be. In fact, one of the traditions that has existed in this nation for a long time is that foreign policy, when it came to issues that impacted the national security of the United States, there was always an effort made to ensure that it was as bipartisan or nonpartisan as possible. Because when America gets in trouble on national security, there is no way to isolate ourselves on a partisan basis. And it is my hope that even as we debate all these other issues, that we continue to keep these issues in mind, because it is critical to the future of our nation. It is critical to our standing in the world, and ultimately it is vital and critical to the kind of world and nation that we will leave to our children and grandchildren in the years and in the decades to come. And I, for one, in the midst of all of this debate about a bunch of issues that divide us, will continue to work to ensure that this is one that unites us and allows us to live up to our constitutional obligation to participate fully in shaping and directing the foreign policy of this great nation. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.